Let's move on to the object of the talk. What does county government do, and why should any of us care? Now, of course, as I was thinking about this talk today, I've given several of these last year, before the election, when obviously all we wanted to do was throw poison darts at the incumbent county executive, which was very easy to do because he was doing so many lousy things and not doing so many good things. But when I was thinking about the way I spoke then and how I might want to change it up this time, I realized that I didn't really want to change it up, except for maybe a couple tiny words here and there. Because the way I always opened it up last year was, you all need to know what we do. Because if you don't know what we do, you can be misled into thinking we don't do anything important. Which means anti-tax demagogues, not mentioning any names, can come in and essentially make a mess of the whole thing. I want to say the exact same thing now, because we got in a very good county executive this time, thanks to your efforts and the efforts of many people all over the county, not to mention the efforts of George, and anyone who's ever seen George campaign knows what that's all about. But if we don't tell people what we do, if we don't have a robust press presence in our building to get the word out as to what we do, if we don't go out into the community to groups like yours and tell you what we do, it's very easy to think it's not very important. Out of sight, out of mind. So what I'm trying to do here is to tell you what it is we do, so it stays a little closer to the forefront of your thinking. And when people talk about county government, or people talk about local taxes, or people talk about any relevant issues, you have an understanding as to what county government is, why it's about, and why we need it. Okay, they're still not evacuating. So, what does county government do? If you look, one of the things you have before you, this is an old newsletter of mine. Actually, no, it's this year's. It's a summer 2017 newsletter. If you turn to the back, below the fold, what county government does for you. This is usually what I talk off of when I give these talks. So you can have something to follow along. If you want to write a couple words and notes near each one, you can do that. This is not a complete list, but this is a list that includes most of the highlights of what we do. Now, in this country, and most countries, we have multiple levels of government. We have the federal government in Washington, we have the state government in Albany, you have town governments, you have village governments, you may have village and town governments. I remember trying to explain that to a friend's au pair who was from the former Yugoslavia once, and she looked at me as if I had two heads. But we have multiple levels, and the reason we have them is because certain things are better run closer to home, and certain things you need the resources and the expertise to run in a more centralized way. County government is, depending on how you look at it, the top of the food chain in local government, or it's the most local, it's the local outpost of state government. Much of what we do, many of the things we talk about, are actually functions that the state government requires be done, and the state has made the decision that having individual counties administer them makes them run better. So that's what we have that bandwidth for. Things that are too big for your town to handle. For example, a multi-$100 million wastewater treatment plant that takes so much expertise in terms of engineering and various mechanical and trade type functions that you can't expect the town of Newcastle to have their own wastewater treatment plant and have it run properly and meet all the state and federal pollution requirements and so on. A bus system. You want a regional bus system because it's easier for people to get several towns over if they don't have to keep crossing from one system to another. Not every town can have its own airport. You may want your own town police department for various reasons, but you're not going to want you don't want every single town and village to have their own police helicopter. That would get expensive, and if they all sent them up at once, it'd get awfully dangerous. So there is a bandwidth for things that are too big for the towns, but things you need closer to home, and that's what we do. Now, what I'm going to do is I'll start talking through the list, so you could look along with me if you choose, and we could go through it. Now, because I was infrastructure chair under Michael, and now I'm public works chair, I always talk about infrastructure first. But that's the physical platform on which all of us live our lives. And a great deal of that platform needs to be done fairly locally, but you still need, again, a larger group than a village or town to get it done properly. So the first thing I put on this list is transportation infrastructure. That includes 149 miles of road. That's basically the kind of roads that go from community to community. Ardsley Road in my part of the county, which connects Greenburgh with Scarsdale, that's a perfect example. I won't get into the fine points to explain why it's broken up, but most of Central Avenue. I think even people up here spend a little bit of time on Central Avenue every now and again. That was originally entirely a county road. We made deals with towns for various reasons we could talk about later if you want the master class. But most of it still is the responsibility of Westchester County.
Isn't some of it also the state?
So, the part of Central Avenue below White Plains, I think, is all county or municipal. When you go to like 9A here, 9A entirely is a state road, which has its own issues because then you're dealing with, how many of you have ever been in municipal government? Okay, one, two, a few of you. Why do we have counties taking care of roads that connect villages and towns as opposed to the state? Anyone who knows anything about Route 9A, which is a state road, depending on who's running state DOT or the state DOT region, we live in DOT Region 8, you might not find it very responsive sometimes when you report a problem on it. When it's a county road, well, under the last administration, they weren't always that responsive either. But if you called up your legislator's office, or sometimes even if you called them up, and you reported a problem, they recognized that they were accountable to the voters. That if they did not fix a problem on the road, there's always this pothole in Warburton Avenue in Hastings that was right in front of one of the volunteer fire departments. And the chair of our local Republican Party belonged to the volunteer fire department. And what he discovered out of everything was that if he called our office when the fill popped out of the pothole and made it hard for the trucks to pull in and out safely, if he called my office, he knew that I had their number on it, and they get a truck out in a day or two and fill up the pothole. And they didn't do that because they cared about infrastructure, believe me. They did that because they knew that the Republican chair in Hastings, if it didn't get done, knew that it was their fault and not my fault. And that's where the whole thing about accountability in government comes in. And the more local things are, quite often, the more accountable people are. But anyway, we have about 149 miles of road. I've seen various numbers all over the place for the number of bridges in Westchester County that are owned by the county. The last list I saw, and I counted myself, I counted 123 bridges. And these tend to be often the kinds of bridges that connect communities. Some of them go over highways. I know it's not in your area, but last week we had the official reopening of the Ashford Avenue Bridge, which connects Dobbs Ferry and Ardsley in the town of Greenburgh. That is a county-owned bridge, and that was built in the 1950s when the New York State Thruway was built, and all of a sudden the two communities were separated. You don't always need a big wall. Maybe Trump should just put a big interstate highway on the border. So the villages of Dobbs Ferry and Ardsley realized they needed a bridge so their people could continue going back and forth to businesses. School districts were on each other's side. The hospital was on one side, the ambulance corps is on another side, and so on. So they priced out a bridge. They couldn't afford it. So what they did was they went the next level up, and they went to the county and said, we really need a bridge here to function, but we don't have the resources. Would you do it? The county said, of course, and they did. Another example is within the village of Hastings, but it's a bridge that connects Hastings and the northwest neighborhoods of Yonkers, which have always had trade back and forth. Families would move from one place to another, so it was important to have a good, strong corridor between downtown Hastings and northwest Yonkers. It was called the Warburton Avenue Bridge. Same story, that one was built in the 1890s, and we just fixed that one a few years ago. But anyway, most of the 123 bridges we have a similar story. Local people needed it. They didn't have the resources to do it. They went up to the county, and the county was willing to do it. We also have the county airport. How many of you have used the county airport? Yeah, most of you. Once again, that's the kind of thing that the town of Newcastle isn't going to do. And you don't necessarily want the state placing it, running it, depending on how much traffic can go in and out of that airport at various times of the day and so on. That's something you want a certain amount of local control on as well. The Beeline bus system. We alluded to buses before and how important they are. Even if you don't use the bus, people who work in your stores use the bus. People who work in your house might use the bus. Students use the bus a lot, especially in our more urban areas. We need a good bus system, and once again, the way you do it best is on a countywide or a regional basis. Paratransit for disabled residents. It's kind of self-explanatory. We run a paratransit program out of our main county office building, and we have the little paratransit vehicles that you might see going around once in a while. Okay, then we get to one of my favorite ones, wastewater treatment. Now, people laugh, and I turn it into toilet jokes for 5th grade mock legislatures and always get a great reaction for it. But you cannot have civilization without wastewater treatment. You don't even want to think about the epidemics that would be caused if we lived in a place as dense as the New York metropolitan area without wastewater treatment plants. Now again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment. It's how you turn what you flush into fairly pristine water you feel comfortable releasing into a stream. It takes a lot of technology. It breaks down a lot. There are a lot of things people flush down their toilets that cause problems, including those quote-unquote flushable wipes. They're not really flushable, and they're like the biggest problem we all have at wastewater treatment plants now, by the way. But you have these, they cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build. They cost tens of millions of dollars a year to maintain. And that doesn't count the salaries of all the people you need on staff to be able to take care of any problems. Your town can't, you don't even want to think about, you think your taxes are bad now, you don't even want to think about what your taxes would be if your town tried to do that themselves. Solid waste disposal, garbage and recycling. In most places of the county, the further north you get, they have a different situation, but I think you're still in solid waste district 1. You get regular garbage pickups from your, okay. Once your municipality picks it up, it has to go somewhere. And generally, it goes to centralized places where the county disposes of it. We have major, there's a big recycling area, facility called the MRF, the Materials Recovery Facility, which is how we get MRF out of it. Down by Stu Leonard's in Yonkers. We also have solid waste central pickup, most of which ends up going to the former Wheelabrator plant in Peekskill, where it gets incinerated in a waste to energy project. And once again, try to have civilization without solid waste disposal too. It doesn't work. The criminal justice system, that's something else that in this country has pretty much always been a county level thing in most places. The county is responsible for building and maintaining the courthouses. We end up paying for prosecutors. We end up paying for criminal defense through legal aid. We also pay, which is not mandated, but we also provide money for civil legal aid for things like eviction prevention, because we'll talk about social services in a minute. If we don't prevent evictions, we end up with more homeless people, which makes it cost effective for us to help out civil legal aid as well as criminal defense. Probation officers, juvenile justice services, all of those are going to become more important. How many of you have heard of Raise the Age? Okay, a few. For quite some time now, New York and North Carolina were the only states who would try 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. Now, as we learn more and more about brain function at different ages, we know that 16 and 17-year-olds don't have the most mature of brains and the best impulse control. I'm sure that any of you who have had 16 and 17-year-olds in your lives, yes, the laughter says it all. So, last year, I believe it was, the New York State Legislature finally decided to raise the age. Except for a few really serious cases. I think there are a few exceptions. You can't be tried as an adult until you're 18. What that does is that puts more pressure on the county probation department and the county juvenile justice services, because all of those 16 and 17-year-olds who would have been tried as adults are going to have to be tried now and taken care of, supervised as youngsters, and that is also a county responsibility. Preschool special education, early intervention, and Westchester Community College. K-12, as you know, and even pre-K-12, some places have it, a lot of places don't, is essentially the responsibility of your local school district. We don't really get involved as a county in that, but on the opposite ends we do. We provide funding for preschool special ed, students who need occupational therapy, speech therapy, and so on. That goes through the county. Westchester Community College. Now, we all know how expensive it's getting to make sure our K-12 has all of the technical instruction and all of the high-level teachers that our students need to function in the 21st century, right? You don't want to think about what it would cost to do a college in every town. So instead, we pool together our resources, we get money from the state, and that is how Westchester Community College is funded and run. And these days, an awful lot of people go to Westchester Community College. For children in poor urban areas, it's often their best chance at a step up. A lot of, for want of a better word, regular suburban kids end up going there for a year or two at some point in their college careers, either between schools, or they start there to save money for junior and senior year in college, or if they're still trying out different majors or career paths and trying to figure out what they do, WCC is a fairly low risk way of working that out. Also, WCC does a lot of career education, continuing education for adults as well. And sometimes businesses will send their people there to be trained in computers, or we have veterinary assistance. We have a good veterinary assistance program, for example. So it's something that benefits everyone, but again, you need the right level of government to handle it. Emergency services and county police. Now, remember those police helicopters I mentioned before? There are certain things that your local police department cannot necessarily handle. Helicopters is one. Dive teams is another one. Forensics. We have a labs and research department that runs tests on whatever pieces of evidence your police collect in a case. We also have county police that is responsible for most of the patrolling of the parkways in our county as well. So when you're driving and you see it's probably going to be a county police officer who's going to be pulling you over. Not always, but usually. And then when you're talking about emergencies, let's say you have a big natural disaster or a terrorist attack. Again, you're going to need someone who could pull together all the municipalities. Some places may be in worse shape than others. You need someone who could husband resources and dispatch them to where they're needed the most. County's a natural player in that as well. Parks, nature centers, golf courses, and trails. We have 6 golf courses, although the numbers are going down some. I understand that young people are not playing golf as much as not young people are anymore, but we still get a lot of people for whom the golf courses are good recreation. And our golf courses are there for the 95% of us who can't afford a country club. We've got parks, we've got swimming pools, we've got half a dozen nature centers. We have Muscoot Farm. How many of you have taken your kids to Muscoot Farms over the years? Yeah, fun place, right? Once again, that's a county responsibility. Restaurant inspections, rabies and other disease control. We all go out to eat, right? It's just, even if you know how to cook, sometimes you just can't. Well, you want to make sure that when you're eating, it's safe. And once again, you need enough people with the expertise, and you need a large enough jurisdiction to make sure it's cost effective for you to hire the people with the expertise you need. That's what you have county government for. Every now and again, I send out e-blasts advertising things like free rabies shots for pets. We have in the county health department a section that deals mostly with things like rabies, tuberculosis, venereal diseases. And once again, for people who can't afford it, or to provide expertise to communities where there are outbreaks. For example, we had 4 last year outbreaks of hepatitis in some of our restaurants. Well, it's the county's job, once again, Portchester, where that Bar Taco was, doesn't have a big health department. We're the ones who are sent in to do the investigation, help send out the notices, and so on. Social services. When you send about 15 to 20% of your local property taxes goes to the county government. The rest goes to your schools or your towns or your villages. But of that 15 or 20 cents that you send to us, close to half of it at this point goes to fund the Medicaid program. The state requires the counties to administer the Medicaid program because, again, a centralized state thing, you're not going to have the kind of outreach or accountability or so on. But unlike just about every other state, I think North Carolina, again, may be one of the outliers with us, most states pay for the whole thing and expect their counties to do it. Here, New York State requires the county to collect most of it out of your property taxes. And that is probably, when you're talking about why are our property taxes so high, especially in relation to, say, something like an income tax or a sales tax. Westchester County actually has one of the lowest sales taxes in the state. But we have the highest property tax. And part of the reason for that is because we're funding the Medicaid program. Now, in addition to Medicaid, we have a lot of other social services. We have your basic assistance to needy families, homeless shelters, child protective services. All of those need to be administered somewhere, and county government certainly is a lot more efficient than, say, a town doing it on its own. But at the same time, again, it's closer to home, so it's easier to do outreach. Things are a little bit more customized to local needs. Community mental health services. We have a lot of people who have various forms of mental illness or other dysfunctions trying to cope with whatever crises they have in their lives. Many of them cannot afford proper mental health care, so we have community mental health services. Also, they sort of provide the same function as, say, the health department. They keep track of what's going on in the county in general, and in terms of what people need to know about, say, like controlling the opioid epidemic or things like that. It's supposed to be our community mental health department that's supposed to be working on some of that with us. Programs for senior citizens, at-risk youth, and victims of domestic violence. When we talk about our more elective, most of these are not required or mandated, but they cut down on our use of mandated services, much like eviction prevention does. If you could provide after-school programs in a city like, say, Mount Vernon that has so much need and so little resources on their own, you may be able to prevent people from entering the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system. Senior citizens help build this county. They built our economy. And of course, as they get older, they have a harder time being mobile on their own. Their financial resources start to suffer sometimes. So the county, again, tries to provide services to help make life better for the people who made Westchester County possible for the rest of us. Land use planning. The county has a planning department that is used for to give technical advice to many of our local governments, because they're supposed to have staff that understands things like zoning, flooding, traffic analysis, and so on. Now, most of our land use decisions get made on the town level or on the city level. But again, so many of our towns, and by the way, villages, a village of 5,000 people may have to just pass on a multi-hundred unit luxury apartment building smack in the middle of a residential neighborhood, and they don't have the expertise necessarily to figure out what all the consequences of putting that development there might be. They need experts to talk to. They have two choices. Either they could pick up the phone and call the planning department, which is the way the county planning department had traditionally been used, or else they're forced to put upward pressure on the village property taxes to hire private consultants. More and more of which is being done now because, remember those people I wasn't going to talk that much about? They decimated the planning department. So a lot of towns and villages now are spending a lot more money on consultants, but that's not the way it's supposed to be because we have a planning department who's supposed to do that for them. And then our election system. I'm sure many of you remember the days when it was actually the town governments who provided the election machines and essentially ran everything. The last 5 to 10 years, that all has been centralized, and that is being run out of the county at this point. Now that just, like I said, that's most of the biggies. What happens when you don't fund that stuff? It doesn't take a lot of imagination to know that if you don't fund a wastewater treatment plant properly, it's going to break down from time to time, and that means you're going to have a lot of stuff in your rivers and streams that you really don't want in your rivers and streams. If you decide that because there's so much downward pressure on county finances, you don't want to fund after-school programs for at-risk youth anymore, we know what that's going to mean. Although that's not going to help your taxes either, because when those kids need to get prosecuted or those kids need probation, you're paying for that too, but you're probably paying more than you would have to make sure somebody was helping them with their homework. I could go on, but you get the idea. This is stuff we need. And most of this is stuff that most of us use every day or almost every day. We ride these roads and bridges on a regular basis. People we know use that airport on a regular basis. And as I tell my 5th graders, and it may not be completely true in Newcastle, but it certainly is down where I am, whenever you flush your toilet, you use county government. It doesn't get more, you use us every day than that, right? So that is what we do. That is what hasn't been done so well the last 8 years. For example, that 149 miles of road, the way it used to work before the evil ones took over is in prior administrations, they would generally try to pave anywhere between 6 and 8 miles of road a year. At this point, if you look at the State Department of Transportation scoring system, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 miles of road that should be paved this year. And as somebody said, and whenever I say this to somebody in a one-on-one conversation, 90% of the times the answer I get back is, and we have no money. And I say that is absolutely right. Unfortunately, we are going to learn more about what county government does because it's going to be really hard to get it done these days. And part of the frustration and the fear in that is I noticed the Astorino administration doing it a fair amount when it was on their watch. Well, your government's supposed to take care of that bridge, and it's falling apart. What's wrong here? And somebody would be talking to a reporter and say, well, you know government, you can't count on government to do anything. But what I always say is, before they took over, or before the Tea Party took over in Washington, government was able to do this stuff pretty, not always great, but they're able to do it reasonably well. But as things fall apart and as pressure on our taxes becomes greater, because you all know what happened with the state and local tax deduction, that's going to be the equivalent of somewhere around a 20% tax increase for many of our property owners, even if they want to make sure this stuff gets done. they're already getting tapped out by the Trump administration. So, God bless George. God bless all of us, but God bless George because he's got an awful lot on his plate here and very little in the way of resources to get it done. But when you look at this list, you know that we have to get it done because we need this stuff, and that's why we're here. So thank you. And I'm sorry I went on, but as you could tell, I care a lot about this stuff, and not too many of you look too bored, so either you're being very polite or, but thank you. So I will take some questions. Okay.
Can you talk a little bit more about how the Board of Legislators works and what its sort of span of authority is and its relationship with the executive and the civil service?
Okay, sure.
Please.
Let me give a little bit of historic background on this. Before 1970, we had a completely different form of county government. It was run by a board of supervisors. Every town or city would send a representative to White Plains, and they'd get together and make decisions on how the county was supposed to be run. In the 1960s, for those of you who ever went to law school, there were one person, one vote cases, and it made one representative per town kind of tricky because Pound Ridge has 5,000 people. Yonkers has 200,000 people, and they were not getting, I think Yonkers had multiple representatives at that point, but you were still blowing a big hole through one person, one vote.
It was like the Senate.
Yeah, very much. But that was the only one that got a free ride in the Constitution because they designed it that way on
purpose.
purpose.
In the Constitution.
Right. So when people saw the writing on the wall, and I understand that there had actually been a lawsuit filed, they developed this form of government. And when you look at it, it actually fairly closely mirrors what you have on other levels of government. You have an elected executive, and you have an elected legislature. Now, what happens in that form of government is everybody is supposed to act as a check or a balance on the other. As George has used the term, as many people have used the term, we are supposed to be co-equal branches of government. George is not my boss any more than Rob was my boss. We're supposed to make most of our legislation does get sent down by the county executive. Most of it is things like bonds to fix our infrastructure, our annual budget, and we analyze it. We have meetings, we have hearings, much like say Congress or the state legislature, and then we vote. In the case of the budget, we can amend it as we choose and vote to approve it as amended, which is what we did last year. And then the county executive has the choice of either vetoing individual lines or vetoing the whole thing. The first year Rob was in office and had a budget, I think he did like somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 vetoes. I don't remember the exact number, but it was in there. And they showed him like spending like an hour and a half signing all the veto things. This time he just, on his way out, he just vetoed the whole thing, and then we overrode it. So from that perspective, it's largely the same. But you have a lot of practices and procedures and laws in place to govern the relationship between, say, Congress and the president, or the state legislature and the governor that you don't have with us. For example, when Congress calls in people from the executive branch, I'm not sure if they're always or if it's just more of a matter of routine, they get subpoenaed, which means they are legally required to present evidence, whether it's testimonial, whether it's documentary. And if they don't, they could get hit with a contempt for Congress citation and end up spending some time in jail. The county government was seen, when it was first formed in 1970, everyone got along with each other a lot better. We'll just put it that way. And there was a sense that things could be a little more informal. So we don't subpoena people as a matter of routine. And the problem with that was shown in the last administration, where we would ask for people to talk about things we cared about, and the administration would refuse to send them down. We'd ask for documents, and we wouldn't get them. Or sometimes they would sit there and they'd lie to our faces, and we knew they were lying to our faces, but we didn't subpoena them. There's no regular process, and we couldn't prosecute their sorry asses for perjury.
You have subpoena power, though?
We do have legislatively subpoena power. And I think one of the things we should probably look at as a legislature going forward is how we feel about the way the process works, because you don't judge the process by when things work well. And at this point, just in the last month and a half or so, things are working pretty well. We call up departments and we get information. I mean, I could tell you times where, and Ellen could tell you times where we'd have a couple people like constantly doing full court press plus press releases plus all kinds of things to try to cajole them to give us information. Now we call up and we get it, and it's great and it's wonderful. But again, government should not be structured based on what happens in the best of times. It should be structured on what happens in the worst of times.
I have a question about the districts and how they are drawn. When I live in Mount Pleasant, for example, and I look at that map of the district of Mount Pleasant, and I say, who decided this? You know, it includes, you know, a little bit of Valhalla, a little bit of this, and then a whole part of Thornwood, Hawthorne, and Pleasantville. Were these things drawn?
Okay. Well, let's start, first of all, with the general principle. Remember that one person, one vote
Yes.
I talked to you about. So just like the state legislature, just like the House of Representatives, every 10 years after the U.S. Census, we redraw our lines to make sure approximately the same number of people. I think there's a 5% variant you're allowed, but make sure that within that variant, all legislative districts contain approximately the same number of people.
They do. Okay.
Now, that can explain why the lines are not completely regular in a way that a rational person would look and say, that's not the way my part of the county works. But at the same time, I mean, it's like any other redistricting process. I mean, we haven't had a history of extreme gerrymandering or anything like that, but sometimes people make decisions on where they'd like to see the lines drawn, more on deal making than on strict public policy. So we're nowhere near as bad as, say, Pennsylvania at this point, but I don't think the League of Women Voters would do them quite the same way. But we do have to account for the population, and that means that you're going to have some weirdness or regularity in them regardless.
Yeah, I want to piggyback a little bit on that question, but take it off from my perspective, which is accounting. Because everybody always looks at, you know, you can subpoena information, yeah, but then you deal with how the lawyers give it to you, which is always a big mess. I prefer the auditors. And it seems to me that in recent years, any auditing that has gone on in the county has been totally decimated. So starting with, as you said, when things go well, that's good. But when things go well, it can disguise something that's wrong underneath. And everybody just likes the numbers. And for case in point, when Andy Spano was in charge and we had all this money from HUD, nobody ever did a compliance audit, which would have revealed
the problem.
So, and one of the first things I said to Rob when he got elected, because he lives in my town, Mount Pleasant, was...
My condolences.
Yeah, but I knew him, because everybody knows him.
You know, you said at the beginning you were going to be good.
Right. But,
I tried. It took me a while.
yeah.
How many minutes in before I said evil once?
Well, yeah, it started out well, because my first conversation with him was he was hounding, you know, the lack of compliance with the HUD. I said, hire some auditors, You gotta do things like the oversight, the audits, the compliance, financial, the safety, the operational, and that will reveal what's good and what's bad. Because if it's
Right.
good, you wanna perpetuate it. So, is there any audit function left at the county? And if so, when you talk about separation of duties, who does it report to?
Okay. Well,
I'm sorry.
when you're talking about an audit, not necessarily in the technical term, but you want to see where all the money goes, where all the resources go, and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
You're talking about a number of different functions.
Right.
George has already asked Tom DiNapoli for his office to do a good once-over on the county and see what functions we're doing well, what functions we're not, what processes we have to put in place or put back into place. So that will probably be a really good question to ask Tom when he comes in.
Yeah, but that's a one-off. I'm talking a
But-
regular, ongoing.
but
Yeah.
I'm getting there.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Okay. We do hire a private accounting firm to do auditing. The thing that kind of concerns me is you put out an RFP or an RFQ, request for proposals, requests for qualifications, and we and the executive branch always seems to come up with O'Connor Davies.
Yeah.
And as for those of you who read the Journal News on a regular basis, you know that O'Connor Davies was caught in some hanky-panky across the river in Rockland County in the past year.
But any thoughts to doing internal auditors?
You know, one of our new legislators, Kitley Colville, is there anybody here from her district? Okay, she's up in the northeast corner of the county. Hi. She's talking about possibly instituting an office of the Inspector General.
Yeah.
And there is a lot potentially to be said for that, and that's something we're going to have to look really carefully at. Because the bona fides of O'Connor Davies aside, and the people I have dealt with as individuals have impressed me as being professional and honest, at least up to a point, to the extent I'm qualified to pass on it. But the thing about that really concerns me is that both branches of government use them. That's not good. And I agree with that. And I think an Inspector General to have an extra check would be good. Because the other thing that's going on too, we do have a finance department and we do have a budget department. And those offices have gotten decimated just like all the other offices have gotten decimated. One of the things I didn't talk about when I was talking about those 50 miles of road that we should do this year, the engineering section of the Department of Public Works has shrunk by over 40% in, say, the last 8 to 10 years. It wasn't all Rob, but the vast bulk of it was Rob. And when you're talking about all departments have shrunk. And yeah, when money's tight and you need to make sure everything's going exactly right, cutting people in finance and in budget is not necessarily the smartest of ideas.
Given that, the one thing that was stuck out like a sore thumb in the budget that you just passed was adding people to the Board of Elections. One of them happened to be a relative of the legislature. How on earth is that justifiable?
It was the only way we could get the budget passed, which meant the extra engineers we put in, which meant the 2% tax increase that we're going to need to fix all this stuff. That was the price to be paid for that. That was what is known. That's kind of the side of legislatures that we don't like that much, but sometimes you end up making deals. And that was the deal. And I will tell you that the request for those people did not come from the Democratic Commissioner.
I'm well aware. You need those votes to get to 2/3? Is that right?
Yeah.
I was going, I might be single question, but I have 3 questions.
Actually, would you like to come up and use the microphone? You don't have to if you don't.
Well, I was thinking maybe.
If your
this is
handwriting
like-
isn't too bad, could you even read that?
One of my questions is like, I'm into process and project management, so I'm curious about the prioritization now for the new, government. How do we get educated as you're prioritizing? You know, because I feel like a lot of the communication comes out afterwards, not while it's happening, and that would be my biggest interest as to the thought process behind prioritizing.
Do you want me to answer that one before you go on to the next one?
Sure.
Okay. Generally, in my committee, what I've tried to do, and I do plan to do it this year after the new commissioners find where the paper clips and the rubber bands are, is call them into my committee to talk about, to give us a sense of an overview of the next 2 years, what they see as being able to do, what they think they're going to have to put aside, and how they're going to be determining all this. Now, Board of Legislators committee meetings are open to the public. They're publicly noticed. They're archived at the westchesterlegislators.com website. So if you can't come to a meeting or you can't stream it live when you're at work, you could always look at it later and see what's going on. And as I said, in my with the departments that come through my committee, I plan to do that.
Okay, thank you. The other question is, can you go a little bit into the decision that was made with the staff that was kept from Astorino's to George? For me, that's personally important. I respect that because I would be curious to know, was it, I would hope it's merit, you know what I mean? So everyone in my town, or a lot of people in my town was like, oh, he's gonna start clean and all this, and I was a little bit leery about that.
Well, basically what happens with decisions like that in government is, you've got the League of Women Voters over here. And you've got, who do we want to put over here? Maybe we'll put Donald Trump. You are much closer to the League of Women Voters, but you're not completely there. So once again, sometimes, people say, if you want me to vote on the override vote, or you don't want me to publicly oppose this, because we ended up with a unanimous override. And that is going to come in handy politically, because we have all of the Democrats, except for Rob Astorino, saying we needed that tax increase, which we, going back to this list again, which we desperately do. But that being said, an individual decision. The people who were kept on, who I've worked with, I think very highly of. For example, I've done a lot of work with Ms. Restiano because she was the backup for the infrastructure committee. So when Aviva wasn't there, or if Aviva needed help, Allie was the one who helped. And she's very accurate, she's very efficient. I get along well with her. And without saying anything in particular about particular people, there were a number of Republicans who were helpful behind the scenes in getting us needed information or telling us which direction to go in the hunt or so on over the years. And over those 40 some odd years since we've had a Board of Legislators, you had people of all factions on the staff. And the idea was essentially creating a central staff that, at least to the degree it can be in that kind of atmosphere, was nonpartisan, or at least only semi-partisan. So we still have a lot more Democrats on the floor than Republicans, I think. But it's good to have a mix of people.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see that, being announced. And the last thing is sort of a suggestion / based on experience. The Bloomberg administration in the city of New York, when they took over, similar situation with the potholes, similar situation with the roads, et cetera, and his administration, in my opinion, really tried to use technology and really tried to invoke from the public, help us help you. And so one of the basic things that they did was start a Tumblr account. A Tumblr account is just a visual
Right.
account of pictures. I would really love to see, you know, something like that being started here in Westchester, across the county, because while we have engineers, while we have, you know, our town, our local, this and that, I feel like there's so many different layers. And again, I'm from Mount Pleasant too, and, you know, we have this road that we supposedly got $2 million for Murphy, nothing's been being done, you know, and it's like, which one is a county road, which one's a municipal road, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And it's pothole after pothole after